This is a story of murder. Hundreds of innocent civilians, including women and children, killed in cold blood. For years, the world had no idea what happened. But when the truth finally came out, it exposed not only the horrors of war, but also the extent to which governments will go to protect their own interests. What if I told you this story isn't fiction, but a reality? This is the story of the My Lai massacre, one of the darkest chapters in US history. It's a story that shook the foundations of public trust in the US government and raised serious questions about the morality of the Vietnam War itself. The pressure on the US military in 1968. From 1965 to 1973, the United States was involved in one of its most controversial wars, the Vietnam War. The conflict was fought between the communist forces of North Vietnam and the US-backed government of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese and their allies in the South, the Viet Cong, VC, fought a guerrilla war. They hid in jungles, used booby traps, and blended in with civilians. For young American soldiers fresh out of high school, fighting in these conditions was a nightmare. They couldn't tell who was a friend and who was an enemy. The Tet Offensive, a major coordinated attack by North Vietnamese forces in early 1968, had seriously damaged the morale of American troops, and more importantly, the morale of the American people. At home, the images from the war were being broadcast on television, showing body bags, napalm bombings, and soldiers returning home in pieces. More and more people were starting to ask, why are we even fighting this war? Now, when you're losing, you start to get desperate. And when you're desperate, you make questionable decisions. By March of 1968, the US military was in that very situation, desperate for a win. The Tet Offensive had exposed weaknesses in the US military strategy. American commanders needed a win, something to show that they were still in control. One such desperate decision was to send soldiers into Quang Ngai province, particularly the village of My Lai, which had been dubbed Pinkville by US forces due to its suspected sympathies for the communist Viet Cong. The US military believed that the Viet Cong were hiding there, using the village as a base for operations. According to faulty intelligence, the village was crawling with enemy fighters. The solution? Send in Task Force Barker. Task Force Barker was the combat unit formed under the command of Colonel Frank A. It was made up of a bunch of angry, frustrated soldiers from C Company under the leadership of Captain Ernest Medina and Lieutenant William Calley. However, things were not as they seemed. The village was not full of Viet Cong fighters, but rather civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly. What happened next was far from a military success. In fact, it was something so dark and tragic that it would forever stain the history of the Vietnam War. The massacre begins, hell in My Lai. It was a hot, humid morning on March 16, 1968, when C Company entered My Lai. The soldiers had been told that any villagers left after 7 a.m. were most likely Viet Cong fighters or sympathizers because, apparently, all the innocent civilians had conveniently gone to the market by then. But, unfortunately, they hadn't. Instead, the village was full of civilians, unarmed men, women, children, and the elderly, people who were just trying to survive another day of the war. But the soldiers of C Company weren't in the mood to ask questions. They had been losing men for months, not in direct combat, but to booby traps, landmines, and ambushes. These weren't soldiers hardened by battle. These were scared, exhausted young men who had been trained to view every Vietnamese person as the enemy. So, when they stormed into My Lai, the bloodshed started almost immediately. One soldier reportedly stabbed a villager with a bayonet, and after that, it was like the floodgates of violence opened wide. Villagers were shot indiscriminately, often while trying to flee. Homes were set on fire. Mothers were gunned down while trying to shield their children. Lieutenant Calley, not exactly a model of restraint, took things even further. He ordered his men to round up dozens of villagers, 70 to 80 people, and march them to a nearby irrigation ditch. When they got there, Calley gave the order to open fire. His men mowed down the civilians, and Calley himself joined in, firing round after round until the entire group lay dead. Some soldiers used their rifles, others used grenades, and some even employed bayonets to kill the civilians. The violence was so extreme that some of the American soldiers themselves were shocked by what they were witnessing. But very few intervened. By the time the massacre was over, at least 500 civilians were dead. The soldiers didn't find a single Viet Cong fighter that day. Not one. So much for military intelligence. The cover-up. The truth gets buried. If you thought the massacre was the end of this story, think again. This is where the cover-up begins. After the massacre, the official reports from Task Force Barker stated that the operation had been a success. According to the military, 128 Viet Cong fighters had been killed. Colonel Orrin Henderson, who was in charge of the investigation, didn't dig any deeper. Why would he? The US military was desperate for a win, and they weren't about to admit that their soldiers had just massacred 500 innocent people. General William Westmoreland, the top US commander in Vietnam, even sent a congratulatory message to the soldiers involved, praising their efforts in neutralizing a supposed Viet Cong stronghold. In military newspapers, My Lai was hailed as a victory. But the truth was much darker. For more than a year, the massacre was buried, hidden under layers of false reports and official lies. Whistleblowers, Ron Ridenour and Seymour Hersh, break the silence. The truth about what happened at My Lai might have stayed buried forever if it weren't for a few brave individuals who refused to stay silent. One of those individuals was Ron Ridenour, a former soldier who had heard rumors about the massacre from his fellow troops. Ridenour wasn't at My Lai, but the stories he heard were enough to haunt him. He couldn't let it go. So Ridenour did what any determined person would do. He started writing letters. He wrote to Congress, to the Pentagon, to military officials, describing the horrors of what had happened at My Lai and demanding an investigation. For months, his letters were ignored. After all, the US government wasn't exactly in a hurry to admit that its soldiers had committed mass murder. But Ridenour didn't give up. Eventually, in 1969, his story found its way into the hands of investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, and Hersh, being the kind of journalist who isn't afraid of a scandal, went after the truth like a bloodhound. Hersh interviewed soldiers who had been at My Lai, pieced together the facts, and on November 13, 1969, he published an explosive article that exposed the massacre and the government's attempts to cover it up. Along with Hersh's article, photographs taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberle were published in Life magazine. These images showed the world exactly what had happened in My Lai: the bodies of women, children, and the elderly lying in ditches, shot at close range. The public reaction: outrage. Public outrage and the erosion of trust. The My Lai massacre and its cover-up struck a deep nerve with the American public. The Vietnam War had already become increasingly unpopular, but the revelations about My Lai pushed many who had been on the fence into the anti-war camp. Protests intensified, and public trust in the government and military took a severe hit. For some Americans, the idea that US soldiers could commit such acts was too difficult to accept. A poll taken in Minnesota shortly after the massacre was revealed showed that nearly half of those surveyed believed the story was either false or exaggerated. Many people didn't want to believe that the country they loved could be responsible for such horrors. But for others, My Lai became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Vietnam War. It showed how far the US government was willing to go to win a war that had no clear moral or strategic justification. The trial of William Calley. After the My Lai massacre made headlines, the military had to scramble into action. Lieutenant William Calley, who had ordered the execution of civilians at an irrigation ditch, became the poster child for the scandal. In 1971, Calley was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison for the deaths of 22 civilians. But his trial sparked a nationwide debate. Cali was seen by some as the unfortunate scapegoat, while others believed his actions were merely the tip of the iceberg in a sea of military misconduct. President Richard Nixon intervened, reducing Cali's sentence to house arrest. Ultimately, Cali served just 3.5 years. For many, this leniency was seen as a sign of the US government's reluctance to fully confront the crimes committed in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre was a turning point in the Vietnam War. It exposed the dark side of the conflict and forced the American public to confront the brutal realities of what was happening in Vietnam. The massacre and the subsequent cover-up eroded public trust in the government and contributed to the growing anti-war movement. But My Lai also raised larger questions. If something like this could happen, how many other atrocities had been committed that were never uncovered? How much did the US government really know? And how far were they willing to go to keep the truth hidden?